Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So, hello and welcome to another episode of a special series of interviews that we're doing. And today we have a special guest with us. He has been a part of the Lutyens gang that the media currently mentions a lot. And he has also been a part of this entire elite system that the government is trying to dismantle somehow. My guest for today is someone who has served as an editor for the Economic Times, the Financial Express, Business Standard, and the editorial page of the Times of India and the Indian Express. He was a media advisor to the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and the Director of Geo-economics and Strategy, International Institute of Strategic Affairs, London. He's out with a new book, India's Power Elite, Caste, Class, and Cultural Revolution. So thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and being on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. This is the book you mentioned just now. It's called India's Power Elite. Penguin has published it just now.
Yeah. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, all I could get was a soft copy on a Kindle edition. So unfortunately, I can only show an image while I edit the interview. But thank you so much for showing the book. So first, let's start with, while I was reading your book, I sense, as you mentioned, that a lot of people have taken office in the last 70 odd years of since independence, but there has not been such a turbulent change of guard in the office, and the new power elite has emerged, which has dismissed the old guard. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, I'm looking at the transition over a fairly long period of time, which is the last 70 years. And I begin with the proposition that unlike in the case of the Soviet Union, the Russian Revolution of 1917, or China, the Chinese Revolution of 1949, or many of the other post-colonial nations in Africa, Asia, where the liberation of those countries resulted in a fairly dramatic shift in the class that was in power. In fact, in Russia and in China, the communists who came to power virtually killed all the earlier monarchs and the feudals, etc. Unlike all those countries, in India, the transition from British India to free India was a gradual transition. What many sociologists and historians have called India's was a gradual revolution. So, for example, the British period, we had what was called the Indian Civil Service, and that became the Indian Administrative Service. Then you had the Indian Police in the British, and that became the Indian Police Service. So, the institutions of the state, the judiciary, the High Court, Supreme Court, the Army chief immediately after independence continued to be a Britisher. The Indian Army structure even today is very similar to the structure we inherited from the British. So the transition of the power elite, which is essentially the political leadership, the judicial leadership, the administrative leadership, the media leadership, business leadership, landowning class, this power elite, there was not a radical change in India as we saw in many other parts of the world. But over a period of time, there has been change. So I am not suggesting that the change happened only in the last 7 years. In fact, if you see at the state level, in many states, you see a transition happening. For example, in a state like UP, Charan Singh, who was virtually a Jat farmer from the countryside, became chief minister in the mid-60s. In Tamil Nadu, the DMK came to power in the mid-60s. In Bengal and Kerala, the communists came to power. So, in a sense, these changes were happening over a period of time. But I think what you find happening in the last few years, and much more sharply during the tenure of Prime Minister Modi, is a rejection of the old elite. I define the elite borrowing a framework from Ram Manohar Lohia, who was a great socialist leader, Ram Manohar Lohia defined the Indian elite as having three characteristics. One, they were essentially upper caste. Two, they were wealthy. And three, they were English speaking. And I argue that while the new elite continued to be very wealthy, they are no longer only English speaking, and they are certainly no longer upper caste. The backward caste, the other OBCs have come to power across many states. And certainly even in the BJP, which was a Brahmin dominated, controlled by a Brahmin dominated RSS, we now have a backward caste leader, Narendra Modi, as the prime minister. So that's the transition I'm looking at in this book.
You also made a very interesting point that Mr. Modi is not the only person to have come as an outsider. Even Narasimha Rao came from the same background, so did Mr. Manmohan Singh. Then what actually made him look like he is an outsider, the first person to actually enter the parliament as uh, as not an MP, but as the prime minister of the country? So what made him look different in the eyes of the public?
That's a good question. Actually, the first person who came, the first prime minister who was a complete outsider in the sense didn't come from the elite, was Lal Bahadur Shastri, though he was a caste from UP, which is an upper caste. But his background was essentially provincial, and he was briefly prime minister. But certainly Narasimha Rao, again a landlord, a Brahmin landlord from Telangana, but very provincial in his upbringing, and was not very well known till he became a foreign minister during Indira Gandhi's second tenure. And then we had Mr. Vajpayee and Manmohan Singh. Again, people who came from modest backgrounds. They were not from the elite. They certainly, Vajpayee was upper caste, but certainly they were not from the upper kind of economic and social groups of the country. But all of them chose to work with the power elite that they inherited, whether it was in the bureaucracy, the judiciary, the intellectual community, the academic community, the cultural elite. All of them chose to work with those important groups of people who were already established within various institutions of power, if you like, the judiciary, the executive, the media, and business, etc. I think what Prime Minister Modi did was, one, to define this elite that he inherited in Delhi as the other. I mean, he called them Luthians, the Delhi Khan Market gang. You know, he's consciously tried to pitch himself in opposition to them. Though his own personal reputation as Chief Minister of Gujarat was of someone who was very close to Indian business. I mean, when Ratan Tata, for example, was not able to establish the nano plant in Bengal, Chief Minister Modi gave free land and a lot of subsidy and attracted him to Gujarat. And a lot of Indian businessmen like Adani, etc., prospered in Narendra Modi's Gujarat. So he came to power as someone who was seen as a darling of business. Anil Ambani called him King of Kings. But having come to Delhi as the darling of the power elite or the business elite, he chose to define himself as a representative of a new aspiring India that was not familiar with the English language, that was not mainly upper caste, mostly backward caste, in fact, and projected himself as the leader of what he called a new India. And that was the change, that was the transition.
Yeah. And since you mentioned Vajpayee, let's talk a little bit about him. So it's not the first time we have a BJP prime minister in the office. Mr. Vajpayee was there. But he somehow, if I could use a succumb to the political elite in Delhi. He did not change it. But here we see a person who completely overthrew the existing power structure uh, of how it operates, and it's a new form of elitism we are seeing. What it has this person, Mr. Modi, done, which Vajpayee could not do at that time? He might have a majority, which Vajpayee did not, but that doesn't make any difference to how he remove all those old guards.
Well, that again is a very, very good question. And I think it's goes to the core of the change we see in the BJP. Prime Minister Vajpayee was very much part of the Delhi power elite. I mean, he was leader of the opposition. He was an important leader of a major political party, lived in Delhi most of his life, and understood the nature of power, understood how power works. And he understood that to be a successful prime minister, he has to work with these various institutions of power. And therefore, his whole attitude was to co-opt them rather than to alienate them. In fact, Swapan Das Gupta, who recently contested as an MLA in Bengal, who's a well-known journalist, writes a regular column in the Times of India, once wrote a column in India Today in which he advised Prime Minister Vajpayee, saying, get your own elite. Why are you using the elite that you inherited from the Nehru Gandhis? Get your own elite. That was a column that Swapan wrote. Now, that was an advice that Modi took of trying to get his own elite. But what the experience of the last 5-6 years tells us is that we are now saddled with a group of people who have very little experience in governance. I mean, we have today one of the most incompetent governments in Delhi. And large part of the incompetence is because you have rejected dealing with those who have the experience of governance. So that is why I compare what has happened under Mr. Modi in Delhi to what happened under Mao Zedong in China. That Mao also, through the Chinese elite out of Beijing, he sent them all to villages. Professors from universities, senior government officials, etc. They were all stripped of all their power, sent off to villages to work as farmers in farms. And the Cultural Revolution was a huge setback for China. It pushed China back by at least a decade, if not more. And that is why when Deng Xiaoping came to power, he rejected all the changes that Mao and his Gang of Four had done and launched on a modernization program, which finally succeeded in making China a great power. So my worry is that a lot of what has happened in India under Mr. Modi's leadership is also setting India back. I mean, the economy has slowed down. There are governance issues. There's a question of competence. So I worry.
Yeah. So the next question is, I'll quote a little part from your book. When Narendra Modi distinguished himself from the Lutyens elite, he speaks for a class that does not accord the social capital that inheritance and education give to those who define what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. Taking this line, when I see Mr. Modi speak, and we have seen the other leaders of the Congress who are so-called the elite by this government, there's a certain class or certain group of people that Modi is actually addressing to. In Bengal, we have seen through the speeches, he have done the same, of how he's throughout his campaign, of how he has used certain phrases, spoke to certain people, tried to create a division of caste system for the very first time in Bengal, which does not exist. So, what is Mr. Modi's audience when he speaks to the country?
Well, that's again an interesting question. Mr. Modi's audience, in my judgment, is very similar to Ramanor Loya's audience. He's the middle caste. The core of his support base are the middle castes. The upper castes are already with the BJP, by and large. I mean, particularly in a state like UP, the Brahmins, the Kayas have been with the BJP. It's the backward caste that were with Mulayam Singh and the Samajwadi Party, and the Dalits who were with Mayawati. And Modi has tried to bring them under the BJP fold. So while assuming that the Brahmins have nowhere else to go but support a Hindu party, Modi has tried to bring in other castes. Even in Bengal, I think Swapan Das Gupta wrote about the subaltern castes, those who did not have power during the long reign of the left and the Trinamool. So in caste terms and even in class terms, he is appealing to the middle, to middle India. That has been, but the contradiction in this whole strategy is that what does this middle India want? This aspirational India, which he himself calls them aspirational India. Those who are not yet well off, want to be well off. They want economic development. They want jobs for their children. They want better housing. They want better schooling. They want better healthcare, which means they want actually focus on development. not on building temples, not on cow slaughter, not on garvapsi, not on the kind of issues that the BJP has been focusing on, but on the economy, on development. So that is the contradiction which again I try to address in my book.
Yeah. So since you mentioned about the aspirational audience, which is more about aspiring Indians, the young audience, I find it surprising, especially if I compare to the present situation in Bengal, though BJP has managed to get just a mere, did not even manage to cross the two-digit number as Prashant Kishore predicted, but I have surprisingly seen over here, I'm from Bengal and I see this, a lot of young Indians, even though they know that what Mr. Modi has done over the last 7 odd years in India, for the national in the central for the central government and the state governments at various places where the BJP was in power, there's still a kind of hope that they see in Mr. Modi's voice. A lot of young Indians. In fact, 2014, if you remember, it was the young audience who went and voted for Mr. Modi. I remember various of my friends bought a ticket just to go to their home just because they believed in Mr. Modi's word of change. So does and Mr. Modi is also critical if it's his role to bring this aspiring India, as you mentioned, to bring in the forefront of Indian politics. But is all the aspiration that Mr. Modi is showing them worth it? Do they have enough capital uh, for these young Indians to actually relish their ambitions, or is it like just the pipe from Hamlin who will just play his flute and until the last moment take you there and drop you?
Well, I think that is the essence of the problem. I mean, the fact is that in 2014, there was a lot of frustration in the country. The economy was beginning to slow down. There was a feeling that the government was not focused on development, that Dr. Manmohan Singh was losing control over the government, and that the Congress party was only focused on trying to get Rahul Gandhi elected. So there was a lot of unhappiness at that time, and all of that converted into support for Prime Minister Modi. And he came to power as a symbol of hope. 7 years later, and even in 2019, when we were going in for the election, it was clear that if he had not used Pakistan and Balakot and all this nationalism propaganda, he may not have done as well as he did. So, you could see even by 2019 that there was a certain element of disillusionment because things like demonetization not working, unemployment rising, all of these were contributing to some amount of frustration among young people, among aspirational Indians. But nevertheless, BJP did well because they used a very nationalistic platform for that campaign. But since then, the economy has not picked up. COVID has come and further tanked the economy. Whatever little growth was happening has got nipped in the bud by this pandemic and the lockdown. So there is a concern. The kind of hope that was generated in 2014, that a strong leader, a powerful leader coming after what they all called Manmohan Singh a weak prime minister. And here we are getting a strong prime minister. Not just in India, the world, Asia, everybody hoped that India would march forward. This was the assumption. In fact, Mr. Modi was celebrated around the world when he traveled around the world in 2014, 15, 16. He was celebrated as someone who was going to push India forward so that in Asia there's a balance of power with China. Globally, there's a balance of power with China. And the rest of the world was worried about China's rise, and therefore everybody saw hope. And then they began to see the Indian economy falter. And the government in India adopt policies that were actually harming India's economic rise. So I think today there's a lot of concern. I wouldn't say it has translated already into a loss of support because there is, as you correctly said, there is still a lot of hope that somehow Mr. Modi will be able to turn things around. And also there is no obvious alternative available at the moment. We'll have to wait and see over the next 2-3 years what happens. But there is therefore still a lot of support for him, but tremendous and growing concern that this government is not able to get its act together. And you can see that even within the BJP. I know a lot of people inside the BJP who are quite worried about what is happening.
Yeah. So This is an interesting the thing that I thought came to me when I was reading your book. As you mentioned, there a lot of public intellectuals have changed in Modi's period. And since we're talking about economy, we have seen in communist China as well, people are capitalist. So do you think in Modi's time, where we see economics or the business side of things, did it change anyways compared to the last administration? Or is it just as a business people often to wade off losses align with whoever is in power?
No, in fact, that is the interesting thing. On the economic front and even on the social front, you see there's largely continuity. There is no fundamental change in the direction of policy except on trade. There was a reversal. The Modi government said we will re-examine all free trade agreements. They chose not to join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement in Asia. So on trade, this whole Atmanirbhar Bharat program meant that India was going to become more inward-looking. Customs tariffs were increased and so on and so forth. But thanks to the COVID pandemic, thanks to the slowdown, you see even there, once again, a change. I mean, recently, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister interacted with the leadership of European Union and restarted negotiations for an India-EU free trade agreement. This was actually stopped 7 years ago when the BJP came to power. But they've now decided to revive it, which means basically on economic policy, there's more continuity than change.
Yeah, and I think it's for people in the media as well to comprehend at times of how the government ideologically bends to which direction, and it's very kind of hard. I don't know for if you might have a different perspective, but I find it hard to understand what Modi's ideological perspective is. Whether he's in the right, but his policies are sometimes very socially uplifting. It's social uplifters. Some of them are kind of left. So is it a mixture of we see? It's like Indian khichdi of what we're seeing over here.
Well, I wrote a column about 3 or 4 years back in the Indian Express called Developmental Hindutva. And I tried to define Modi's ideology as that of developmental Hindutva, which is that on the one hand, push the agenda of Hindutva, that Hindus are the natural kind of inheritors of Bharat, that we are the dominant community, we are the majority, and therefore power vests with the majority, even through a democratic process. And everything else that goes with the whole ideology of Hindutva. But at the same time, focus on development, on economic growth, etc. And I thought that this was because that was the inheritance of Gujarat, that Modi came from Gujarat, which was one of India's more developed states. But I think what we have seen as, because the economy has not been able to deliver, what we see is a greater assertion of Hindutva, of Hindu nationalism. I mean, even the 2019 election was not fought on the basis of the performance of the government as far as the economy was concerned. It was fought on the basis of kind of a nationalism, that put Pakistan in its place. We have, taken a tough line on Balakot and this whole thing, which was a subtle kind of Hindu-Muslim dimension to it, because anything to do with Pakistan brings in that communal angle. So if you ask me the question, what is Modi's ideology? As I said, I assumed it was developmental Hindutva. But I guess now we find increasingly the focus is on Hindutva and less on development, unless there's a reversal of the current kind of lethargy in dealing with the economy.
Yeah. So also interestingly, you mentioned in the last chapter, one of the last chapters of the books, that the new intellectuals, since we're talking about Hindutva, the new intellectuals surrounding Amit Shah and Yogi Adityanath belong to a very different world, and they speak a very different language. And in this current scenario, Romila Thapar and a writer's policy intellectual like Montek Ahluwalia are members of the same class, the same social set. So even for a person or for the person who preaches Hindutva, probably you can say in this current environment, Swapan Dasgupta is an elitist because he's from an Oxford educated. He's an Oxford educated. So what is even how is this in spite of like Hindutva, like we are seeing a social division as well in ideology. That's new. We haven't seen this before.
That's right, and that's very interesting because the fact is that there are right through Prime Minister Vajpayee's period, he attracted a lot of global talent around himself because people saw Vajpayee as a kind of liberal Hindu, uh, someone who believed in the pluralism of Hinduism. We are a religion of many gods, many goddesses, many beliefs, and in fact, even atheists can be Hindu and being atheist. So our inheritance is a liberal inheritance, and I think Vajpayee and Narasimha Rao represented that. Narasimha Rao being a South Indian Brahmin, Vajpayee being a North Indian Brahmin, represented that liberal face of Hinduism. What we now find emerging within the BJP and people like Yogi Adityanath or Amit Shah or many of the others represent is a much more kind of hardcore Hindutva which does not respect this liberal aspect. Which defines Hinduism in much more in narrower terms and demands of you, your loyalty. Hinduism never demanded loyalty from its believers. Unlike books of the religion, where you have to learn, read the Bible, read the Quran, you have to, affirm your faith in the text. Hinduism had never any text. Even the Ramayana had many versions of it. The Mahabharata had many versions of it. So there was no single version. And that was the greatness of this religion, which is why it survived for thousands of years. But now there's an attempt to kind of canonize it and define it in narrower terms. And those who are doing it more out of their insecurity because they don't have that confidence of the elite. They come from essentially what I call vernacular medium. They're more familiar in Hindi or Gujarati, they are not very comfortable with people from other parts of the country. So there's an assertion of localism, provincialism in the way in which Hindutva is now being promoted.
So you mentioned this very important thing that the government actually was very capable enough to actually institutionalize religion. And to be honest, over the last few years, I have seen, if I can credit this to Mr. Modi's assertion, that leaders from the opposition parties as well started putting out pictures when they go to temple, which is rare. We haven't seen this before. I don't think that you have seen when Mr. Manmohan Singh was in power, because I think going to a temple or going to any prayer house is a very private affair, and we haven't seen a lot of this come up on social media. Is this something new that you're seeing that from the opposition as well to balance and check out?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, in the sense that it is more visible now. But look at, for example, you're from Bengal, you said. I mean, look at the communists in Bengal. They were the ones who were members of every Durga Puja committee. You would be a member of the CPM, but you will also be organizing the Durga Puja in your locality, right? So the left was very active in social activities, which were obviously religious activities. Durga Puja was religious, but it was also about music and dance and social gathering and eating good food, etc. So they had no problem being part of that. I mean, in Maharashtra, the whole Ganesh procession and the 10-day period when the whole of Maharashtra has these Ganesh pandals, all the political parties were involved in organizing these. So religion was been very much a part of Indian social and political life right through. So in that sense, it's not something new. But I think what is new is you're being asked to prove your credentials. You have to, I mean, for example, Rahul Gandhi pulled out a thread and said, I am a Brahmin, JNU Brahmin. No, you're being asked to prove your credentials. This is new. This is new. And this is not, in my judgment, the Hinduism I grew up with, where none of us were asked to prove anything. In fact, if anything, JNU was seen something as a caste identifier. And the whole movement against caste meant that, I mean, I did not. I'm from a Brahmin family. I didn't have my Upanayana. I didn't wear my Janayu because I said that identifies me with Brahminism. And I'm not going to identify myself with any caste. But that was the
phrase in which Hinduism was liberal and people were rejecting caste. Today, I don't see any inhibition in asserting your caste, in asserting the fact that you're actually wearing a thread around your neck.
So the next part, I want to talk a little bit about the media. So let me ask you from your experience of being the media advisor to Mr. Manmohan Singh, and you managed his office, you managed his affairs with the media. Do you see a very distinct difference in the way that Mr. Manmohan Singh approached the media and Mr. Modi is approaching, with his very style of not giving press conference, one-to-one conversation, and directly giving the message out to the public? And you see, I've seen interviews with Mr. Modi, mostly with his likable media channels, and you see very less number of cross questions being asked as well. You ask him the question, he answers you, and that's it. Is it a very distinct difference between the way Mr. Manmohan Singh approached the media and Mr. Modi is approaching?
Of course, and not just Manmohan Singh. You look at even Prime Minister Vajpayee. I mean, I've been in the media in Delhi since 1990. I've seen Prime Minister Narasimha Rao's relationship with the media, Vajpayee's relationship with the media, Manmohan Singh's relationship with the media. They all recognize the importance of a free press in a democracy. They recognize the importance of having a working relationship with the media. And media has all its faults. I'm not denying. In fact, in my book, I talk about different kinds of journalists, those who are professional, those who are not professional, those who are corrupt. So it's not as if media is some kind of an ideal institution. Every institution in this country has the good, the bad, and the ugly. But as prime ministers, all of them understood the importance of dealing with the media. Problem with Prime Minister Modi seems to be a psychological problem. I mean, the fact that by and large, the Delhi media took a very critical view of his handling of the situation in Gujarat in 2002 after the Godhra incident, the killing of Muslims, etc. He took a very, very sharply negative, psychologically warped view of the media and came to Delhi saying, I'll put these guys in their place. By the time he came to Delhi, of course, he used the social media. Twitter was there, and he was able to use social media to directly reach out. And he said, I don't need this organized media. I can directly communicate with my support base. I don't need to go through all these newspapers and television channels. And if I have to, then I will make sure that they're my channels, my papers. So you now have, whether it's Arnab Goswami or Rahul Shivshankar or Rajat Sharma, a whole lot of television characters who are openly pro-Modi and don't have, hardly critical of him. And so, yes, for whatever reason, I cannot understand, because by and large, media, by and large, tends to be professional. They're interested in the news. They're interested in getting stories. They are quite happy to work with whoever is in power. But if you want a completely servile media, then you end up in the kind of situation you have today, where the media is being forced to be critical of the government because the facts on the ground, I mean, all those dead bodies around the country are forcing, journalists to wake up. How long can you live with the illusion that everything is all right?
Yeah. Since we talk about media, we cannot neglect the fact that Mr. Modi has able to divert the media attention to a huge extent through other non-issues. And you also mentioned in the book about those critical pieces that has been written on various critical pieces written in New York Times or probably the Washington Post about the government previously. The previous government did take notice and did take action. But over we see the foreign minister in one of the conferences mentioned that he does not care about what the New York Times is writing or the Washington Post is writing. Uh, and we have seen a very pathetic look at how the government is actually dealing with the foreign media coverage. We have seen what the Time magazine has done, what we have seen the Washington Post or New York Times writing. But Mr. Modi has a way of dealing with his supporters, as you mentioned. In spite of the pandemic today as well, if you have seen a series of tweets have went through where they say the Prime Minister is working hard amidst the pandemic. So, what is this style of approaching that you do not care about the foreign media and yet you have your own way to deal with your supporters?
Well, first of all, I begin with the proposition that there are biases in the media, right? I mean,
I don't think we can deny the fact that Western media has for a long, long time been biased as far as India is concerned. So it's not as if they are very, very objective. I mean, you look at even in the US, Donald Trump openly accused CNN of being biased. Fox News has been openly accused of being biased. So biases in the media are universal. Just as in India, you have people with biases, in the West also you have people with biases. So when someone says, oh, the Western media is biased, that's a statement of fact. I mean, many of them are biased, but not everybody is biased. There are also professionals. But I think the point I would make is that if you want the support of the media, if you want an image to be developed through the support of the media, then you also have to live with the criticism of the media. You can't have one and reject the other. You can't say, as long as the media projects me in a positive way, I will love it. And the day they project me in a negative way, I will not love it. That's not possible. You got to live with what you get. If, after all, the media has taken a very positive view of many prime ministers in the past, as well as critical view. And you have to live with both. You can't, I mean, we have now, not just in Modi and in Delhi, but across this country, many chief ministers who are intolerant. They have put cartoonists in jail, cutting across political parties. So this kind of intolerance of criticism is simply unacceptable in a democracy. You can say, I'm not going to pay attention. That's your privilege. You don't have to pay attention. But you can't, malign people because they disagree with you.
So this is the last question about media. Probably I'll just have two more questions after this. So interestingly, as you in the media section, I've seen that it required one of the a senior journalist, to speak out on this. That it's just not this section of journalism which we are seeing, a certain section of journalists who are biased. There were biases previously as well, and previously journalists have also reaped out of benefits of politicians of sharing relationship. And I'll quote from this. Present you're mentioning, the TV anchor's brand and proprietor's wealth have enabled journalists to own fancy homes in South Delhi, a pricey flat in South Mumbai, farmhouses and gateway homes in the foothills of Himalayas, or in Goa holidays. And this journalist pre-emergency era could never dream of such a lifestyle. Uh, People might say in this, for example, journalists like Arnav might say there was the Latins media previously. We came and replaced the Latins and we are the new Latins now. Do you see the same shift that, as you have seen in other sectors, in the media as well, that there has been a sudden shift?
Well, there are several questions in that question of yours. First of all, the point I make about the media is that it's become a source of considerable income. In the 60s, 70s, into the 80s, journalism was not a particularly attractive profession. It didn't pay very well. Most people became journalists out of an ideological conviction. They wanted to, report the truth, or they had, ideological motivations. But journalism was not seen as a paying profession. And I, in fact, mentioned my own case where when I decided to move from the university to become a journalist, my vice chancellor scolded me, saying, what nonsense, the university professor is a better job than becoming an editor. That was the view in the 80s, till the 80s. That began to change after 91. And journalism, particularly in Delhi, has become a very paying profession. And I draw attention to the fact that many journalists have prospered. Now you have people who are editors with farmhouses in Gurgaon, flats in London, things like that. A lot of money has been made by journalists. That's one aspect of it. But the other is that it remains a profession. It remains a profession in which it's not very easy. It's not very easy to come up. But you have a lot of temptations, and a lot of people yield to those temptations. As I said earlier, I mean, you have the good, the bad, and the ugly in every profession, and so do you in the media. But the profession cannot be defined by the bad or the ugly. It has to be defined by the performance of the good. I think we have a lot of examples of very, very talented and professionally competent journalists. And in fact, one thing that has happened in the last year with the pandemic, etc., it shows how hard many journalists are working. And the number of journalists who have died due to COVID, like doctors, etc., shows that they are at the front line of reporting.
Yeah. So a couple of last points before we end this. So let's a little talk about the army. There are other institutions you mentioned in the book, such as police and the bureaucracy at large, with civil services and other, which has also been received a heavy hand. But army is one of those institutions, as you mentioned, that has got an upper hand in Modi's time. It has basically been politicized. It has been shown, especially with Balakot airstrike, a sense of nationalism, and a lot of people, young people, has inspired more from the army rather than the civil services. And in one of the points I want to take from your book, the recent decision of the central government to create the Office of Chief of Defence Staff, and more importantly, to make CDS the executive head of newly constituted Department of Military Affairs, with the Defence Ministry has altered, albeit at the margin, the relationship between the civil service and the armed forces, with the highest decision-making organization in the government, raising the profile of the latter. If you could expand a little bit on this, and I know a lot of criticism has been made on the Chief of Defense Force, and in fact, I remember a couple of days back on Twitter, I saw your tweet when Mr. Prakash, Lieutenant General Prakash Menon made this point that it's time for us to take a step and take the risk of having a person who served in the army to make them give the defense portfolio. You strongly criticize it. We have seen the army is largely steered away from politics, which is a good thing in Indian context because we have seen what our neighbors have went through. But do you think in this time there is a dangerous sign of being it politicized, highly politicized?
First of all, I should clarify that I have this brief section on the armed forces in this book because I was following the structure of C. Wright Mills. As I say at the very beginning of my book, there's a very famous American sociologist who wrote a book called The Power Elite in the 50s, and he identifies the military leadership as an important part of the power elite in the United States after the war. Closer home in South Asia, we have seen in many of our neighboring countries, the military, the army is a very important part of the power elite. In Pakistan earlier, and even in Bangladesh, certainly today in China, the armed forces are a part of the power elite. And that is why in India, I think it's important to recognize that they were not such an important part of the power elite. And the relationship between the civilian political leadership and civilian bureaucratic leadership and the armed forces is a matter that has been discussed over the years. In fact, there's a very good book written by a researcher in Singapore, Anit Mukherjee, which goes into great detail on this relationship. So I don't really go into any detail on this. All I say is that in India, the armed forces have been kept outside of the power system. They are there, they're very much there, but the civilian leadership ensured that they do not have the same clout, for example, as the judiciary has or the IAS bureaucracy has. And the armed forces were actually kept under the thumb of the IAS. This new department that has been created brings into question that whole equation within the Ministry of Defense between the IAS chaps and the army people. And I know for a fact from speaking to many officers in the Indian Administrative Service that they are a little concerned. They're waiting to see how this will evolve. They are not entirely satisfied with the whole logic of this new initiative. But having said all that, I think the larger point I try to make is that it is for the first time that the BJP as a political party brought in leadership of the armed forces into active politics. I mean, every time a retired service person joined the BJP, there used to be a big photo op, party headquarters. They would go to the party headquarters. This happened even during Vajpayee's time, and certainly after Vajpayee, during Mr. Advani's leadership. A lot of retired people from the armed forces, in order to establish its nationalistic credentials. I mean, the BJP is always obsessed about saying we are more nationalist than everybody else. And one evidence of that is, look, how many retired personnel, armed forces personnel are with us, to prove that the nationalist credentials. For the first time, Prime Minister Modi appointed an army chief as a minister. VK Singh became a member of parliament and a minister in his government. So in that sense, the
Now, every retiring service chief will think, okay, what will I get next? Maybe I'll come back member of parliament and I'll be a minister. You are creating a very, in my judgment, a new situation, a new equilibrium between the armed forces and the civilian leadership. How this will evolve, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. So the last question is, I have in the very last chapter, you talk about the NRIs, and you talk about how it's such a waste of public money that we spent on these people, and there's a huge amount of brain drain that we have seen over the last uh, few years. And also the other fact that you mentioned is these are the people writing those critical pieces, and they're not there in the country in the first place. So one is there are a lot of young people who are aspiring that same section that you mentioned are probably going to go through the same phase because this is a repeated cycle. It's not that the previous generation is the one that who aspired to for the American dream. Even in our time as well, even in my age, there are people who are aspiring the same. So how can we stop this from happening? Is Mr. Modi doing enough? Because we see a large reception when he goes to a foreign country, the NRIs. But critically, we have seen this is a huge wastage of public money, that these people are not there in the first place to our country to serve, taking the benefits from our country, from the IAs and the IITs and the IIMs.
That the reason I have that chapter in this book is since my book is about India's power elite and India's elite. India is one of the few countries, the few major countries, in which there has been such a large out-migration of the elite. If you look at immigration into the United States, for a long time, it was the people who were unhappy in their own countries, particularly unemployed, poor, who are migrating. Italian poor, East European poor, Hungarian poor, Polish poor, Russian emigres, political emigres. But India has exported over the last 25, 30 years a large number of highly talented people, right? And it's of increasingly educated India. We now have lots of schools, as I mentioned in the book, that actually educate you, train you, give you a IB degree in order to qualify for admission abroad. So Australia, New Zealand, Britain, even Dubai, Singapore, United States, of course. And there is a lot of this is the elite. All of it is not necessarily highly talented. Many of them go because of the money, not because of their brains. But a lot of people with very good brains are. And brain drain was an issue that Jagdish Bhagwati, a very distinguished economist, wrote about in the 1970s. But nobody has really worked on it. So when the United States, for example, says, "Oh, you have such a huge trade deficit," Donald Trump imposed all kinds of trade restrictions on India, removed GSP, saying India has a trade deficit, trade surplus with the United States, and you are practicing all kinds of unacceptable trade practices. Our question to Donald Trump should be, let's estimate how much India has done for the America's development. Look at the millions of Indians in the most advanced sectors in the United States, in IT, in science and technology, in biotechnology, in academia. So actually, India has one of those countries, and not the only one. Japan, Korea, and China in the past also contributed enormous talent. Russia contributed talent. But certainly India is contributing talent, and it's not a developed country. And a lot of this flight, I call it the secession of the successful. These are successful Indians. They've had privileged access to education in India. They have property in India. And yet they go abroad and they work for the United States or work for other countries. And for me, that's a matter of concern.
Yeah. So that's the way we can end it probably. That it is concerning of what's happening in the country, and it's the current elites needs to wake up and probably take the reins because to stop more further brain drain and encourage more young people like us to stay in the country. But thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and being on the show. I hope it wasn't the regular media interviews that you have been appearing, because I believe the future of media is independent media.
Well, first of all, I enjoyed talking to you, and I'm delighted you read the book. And I wish you all the best. God bless you.
Thank you so much, sir.